Our next speaker is Tumi Dlamini, Tumi Dlamini, corporate lawyer, a diplomat, advisor, special board member, CEO and founder, advisor to the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, an agency of the African Union. She advises African countries on policy reforms to improve and strengthen corporate governance practices in Africa. She's assessed corporate governance practices and advised governments in several countries, including Ghana, Liberia, Senegal, Uganda, South Africa, Ethiopia, and several. She's currently led the Africa development of the first ever African Principles and Guidelines on Corporate Governance and chairs the Committee on African Corporate Governance Principles and Guidelines. Recently appointed to chair the South African bid for the 2021 FIFA Women's World Cup, she aims to mobilize support for the bid and the Women's World Cup in Africa to drive social change and transformation for girls and women. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Tumi Dlamini. Tumi, you have the stage now.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I hope it's still morning where you are. My name is Tumi Dlamini. Yeah. So thank you for that warm introduction. I'm so happy to join all of you, and Patricia, on behalf of APRM, would really appreciate and extend sincere warmth for the invitation to come and engage in this platform. As the introduction has indicated, I represent the African Peer Review Mechanism, and that is an agency or organ of the African Union. So the African Union as a whole has a number of agencies, and this specific one, the African Peer Review Mechanism, is mandated to engage member states and promote good governance on the continent. So I have sent my presentation and would greatly appreciate it if you could please.
Okay, you just hold on. Just a moment for that. Yeah, so sorry about that.
So I think while the presentation is being loaded, I was just stating that as representing APRM, our core mandate is to promote good governance on the continent. And in this regard, we have a number of governance areas that we focus on, given that governance is so broad. And one of those areas is corporate governance. And that's what I'm going to be speaking about today. And specifically, the request was, please speak about corporate governance in Africa, but also engage on the intersection of corporate governance and diplomacy, which is often an area or a subject that doesn't get enough engagement or doesn't generate enough research from several scholars, as well as with regards to practitioners, either diplomats or corporate governance experts. So then I will speak about how at APRM we have seen and acknowledged the need to use corporate governance as a tool for diplomacy. In this regard, just very briefly, I did say that we're an agency of the African Union. I also did mention on the 4 areas and specifically focus on democracy and political governance, economic management, corporate governance, and socioeconomic development. And with regards to diplomacy, I think Patricia will put the slides up as soon as she has them, but I will just continue.
Yeah, they're putting them up now. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. So if they can just want to slide 5 already. So with regards to public or global diplomacy, I thought it would be important to contextualize the engagement today and couch it within the context of diplomacy. So I think when we think about diplomacy, we often think about state-to-state engagement, and particularly around political issues. And of course, there's multilateral diplomacy, which involves institutions that are intergovernmental, engaging with other intergovernmental institutions, or even those intergovernmental institutions engaging with states. So for instance, the UN engaging with South Africa, or the UN engaging with the WTO, and so on. However, what we have often missed and what has evolved over time is the rapid shift from this very narrow and traditional definition of what global diplomacy is to now moving into diplomacy that involves non-state actors. So this could mean the private sector, the civil society, engaging either amongst the civil society themselves, or the private sector engaging with governments, or even multilateral institutions engaging with the private sector. So that level of involvement does in fact constitute diplomacy, because when you look at the outcome of some of these engagements, and because we specifically focused on Africa, so let's say, for instance, I'm based in South Africa, and a number of South African companies operate outside of the borders of South Africa. And in their engagement, in their broader engagement on the continent, it's not just purely the engagement that is based on their bottom line or the engagement that's based on their commercial operations, but those entities begin to also engage on public policy discourse around trade and investment policies. And so that, in a way, is also a form of diplomacy. Now, why corporate governance? Within corporate governance at APRM, as it is one of the major, sorry, I'll just take myself off the screen because so that I can focus. So within APRM, we go to member states, so 55 of the African countries, and we assess each of those countries on their compliance and their performance around each of the 4 thematic areas that I mentioned. And those being, of course, the corporate governance being one of them, but democracy and political governance being one of those. And what we have found, and APRM is 20 years old, and what we have found is that consistently, we find that there is very minimal compliance with corporate governance standards and practices on the continent. So we would then, as APRM, give a number of recommendations to member states in terms of how to improve the corporate environment and corporate governance. But over time, we then realized that what was becoming more important was to actually ensure, thank you, this is where we should be. What was becoming more critical was to how to ensure that member states, and particularly the private sector, has the ability to grow, and in fact has the ability and the capacity as well to operate efficiently, competitively, so that they could contribute to our economies, right? And because that's why the private sector exists. So, prior to COVID, 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies were in Africa. And that's when we took the decision that it was necessary to support member states beyond just giving them recommendations, but to actually come up with a tool which we now call the African Principles and Guidelines on Corporate Governance. And then it was important that this tool be established, because when our research identified the reason why member states or private companies in Africa were not complying with corporate governance, we recognized that our countries tend to import corporate governance rules, practices, and principles from the Western global countries and bring them onto the African continent, customize to very minimal extent, and then name them, like, say, for instance, the country corporate governance rules. However, what we are missing is the fact that those Western developed and Western designed corporate governance rules and practices were designed for specific commercial environments. And those environments do not exist on the continent. So we actually had to start back, move backwards to say, where do we have to begin when we come up with what we call the African way of conducting business? Number two, what do we as African countries need to develop in order to grow our economies? So taking into account the dominant sectors, and that's the SMEs and the SMEs and the informal sector, but also taking into account the existing multilateral and international companies that are in Africa. And so therefore, we engaged with a number of countries across all the 5 regions. We went to Ghana, we went to Nigeria, Senegal, and in Central Africa, we went to DRC, Ethiopia in the east, Uganda, and of course in the south, South Africa, Mozambique, Malawi, and some other countries. So we think we had a very representative group of countries through which we then came up and say, based on our own research, we believe that, first of all, there is a need to develop what we call the African principles and guidelines that ensure that they take into account the socio-cultural environment of Africa. So they respond to that, but also they respond to the need for development. So if you can move, please, to the next slide. So then where do we intersect? How do we find that there's an intersection between diplomacy and corporate governance? So I mentioned that what we found in member states is that most countries did have corporate governance guidelines, but that these guidelines were imported sometimes from the UK, the Wales principles, and that is a form of that has been for a number of years a form of diplomacy, and that's the kind of diplomacy that we in economic diplomacy that we have engaged in as Africa, and obviously when I say economic diplomacy, I'm limited to corporate governance. I need that to be very clear, but that's the sort of diplomacy we've been engaged in, that we are imports of standards, we are imports of practices, of rules. However, the development of our own rules and practices ensures that we begin to engage with the world based on our own ingrown, homegrown principles, which are based on our own practices as Africa. So with globalization on the rise, then we recognize that unless we begin to undertake those kinds of initiatives, we would continue to say our countries were not, in fact, compliant with rules without actually understanding the why part of it, and also to say, what do we then do about that intersection? The next slide, please. So the case for a paradigm shift, next slide. And this is where we then came up and said, there needs to be a paradigm shift to how the world, not just Africa, to how the world actually begins to identify or define corporate governance. Because so far, corporate governance, and this is evolving, has been defined as processes and decisions that an organization or a company makes in order to drive its profit. So the narrow definition ensures that when we speak about corporate governance, we just focus on the decisions of the board vis-a-vis the decisions, the engagement with the executives, the employees, and as well as the nearby customers. But if you look at how we believe that as developing states, the decisions of a company must not only be narrowly limited to just how a company is able to enrich or rather to to come up with decisions for its bottom line. The decisions of a company, yes, that's an important part, because the business of business must be business. But the business of business in a developing country must also be about a company's contribution to the community and the society within which it operates. And this is where we speak of Ubuntu in Southern Africa. That every single African individual, and I know that in this room we can relate to this as Africans. However, what we don't recognize is that the diplomacy part of it is that this is how we've done our work. Therefore, we need to be able as well to export how we do things in the same way that for a number of years we've been importing how to do things. So if you look at the African principles, we then said there are two specific areas that corporate governance needs to encompass. Yes, in terms of the principles of transparency, accountability, disclosure, and so on, and financial information discourse, but also it is important that we guide companies that operate on the continent, particularly global companies, in terms of how to make a contribution to society. And with regards to SMEs, corporate governance must at all times take into consideration that corporate governance practices must look at how to develop SMEs, both from a perspective of how larger companies engage with SMEs, and across the entire value chain, but also from a perspective of how local authorities also supports the development of SMEs. Next slide, please. So going forward, if we move on with the economies and politics, and that there's an intersection between culture, politics, and the economy. Therefore, our own cultures and the manner in which we've done things and Ubuntu must also be featured in political diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and economic diplomacy. And I believe that's what there is a new map of going forward, which is saying we must engage around on the continent. Next, please. So with regards to these African principles, which we then came up with, we then said it's important that we take into consideration all of these factors and address the development, and that they address the development, competitiveness, and empowerment of dominant sectors, SMEs, that they entrench governance practices that, as we have known over time, accountability, disclosure, and that we confirm the fundamental role of business to make a positive contribution to development. Next slide, please. And so therefore, these principles, one of the things that I say in this slide is that, you know, they coincided, the development of these principles coincided with the unfortunate COVID-19 pandemic. And for us as APRM, we saw that when we looked at how the private sector reacted and responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, in the sense that we started to see companies, and particularly the financial services sector, being engaged more in public policy issues around helping and supporting SMEs, that in fact, private companies can play the role, the developmental role if required. And that's what COVID showed us. And this happened across the continent, where in Kenya, you found the manufacturing sector working very closely with government with regards to producing at a very large scale and at very quick turnaround time, you know, the masks. And we saw again academics working closely with government and private sector. And we said, these are all the issues that we have always spoken about as necessary. However, that COVID-19 brought this to the fore. And therefore, if we want to ensure that we continue these practices, these need to be entrenched as a way of doing business. Next slide, please. We then said, with regards to the principles themselves, it's important to have very clear principles, but to also distinguish between the different categories of businesses, because depending on the size and the scale of each business, then such a business will be able to comply with the principles, but only to the extent of its size and its operations. Next slide, please. So when we look into, when we therefore look into the multilateral organizations, you'll see here we categorize the private sector on the continent according to multinationals and listed firms. We put those together. Unlisted firms, which are large, SMEs, the informal sector. SMEs, we group them together with family-owned businesses, and then, of course, the informal sector and non-governmental organizations. So what are these principles that we believe not only, number one, reflect our own African socio-cultural environment, but also will lead to the growth of businesses, thereby ensuring their contribution to creating jobs and growing our economies. So the first principle was around a shared purpose that adds value to society, based again on the philosophy which exists across the entire continent, but in Southern Africa we refer to as Ubuntu, and in East Africa it refers to as Ujamaa. So this is, the first principles, an effective business organization is guided by a shared purpose, ensuring that its operating strategy, values, mission and vision, and organizational culture add value to the society and respects the diverse interests of people where it operates. And this is where I believe that if we have multinationals and companies operating on the continent, even in far outlying rural areas of the continent of our countries, it is important that there is a shared purpose. And we then go into detail, and I will circulate this presentation. But then the principles go into minute detail as to what does this principle mean for a multinational? And what does this principle mean for an informal sector or an SME company? Now, a clear governance framework is the second principle. An effective business organization is guided by a clear governance framework. So ordinarily, you would say, and this is what we found to be true as well, SMEs, for instance, on the continent, SMEs are too small to have one aspect of corporate governance compliance, which is the board. And yes, across every country where you find a corporate governance framework, our frameworks insist that every company in the country must have the board. But we do know that it's almost near impossible, both in terms of the financial requirement of putting a board together, but also the size of the company. It's almost impossible for such SMEs to have the board. So what these principles do is they break down as to what a board requirement would mean for an SME. So for instance, an advisory role, which fulfills the mentorship aspect, which will take the SME to the next level. So those are the sort of details that I may not get to in this presentation, but it's all part of the presentation. So the third principle, authentic and inclusive leadership. An effective business organization develops and promotes authentic and inclusive leadership and decision-making processes, committing to rational and ethical business practices. Again, it seems like a very clear and concise statement because we all understand what leadership is. But when you break it down to say, what does actually leadership mean within our own context? We find that our own context determines that our leadership in Africa tends to be very consultative, whereas they may not necessarily be the case in the Western world. So that consultative process that we see in our villages when we go back home, we've discarded it in order to promote other leadership qualities that serve us within the economies to some extent, but then you recognize that actually the manner in which we have done things is not reflected in our workplaces. Disclosure and transparency, I think these for all of us are very clear and necessary principles for any governance framework. And effective stakeholder relationship. Again, with regards to effective stakeholder relationships, we need to broaden what stakeholder relationships mean for a company. So traditionally, stakeholder engagement in a company would involve, first and foremost, the employees, management, and then next would be the suppliers or the advisors, or but quite often people that are very limited, that are very close to the operations of the company. However, if we're looking at company as an organism or as a citizen of a country, therefore its stakeholders must extend broader than itself to include, for instance, the society within which it operates, the youth, and education, and aligning with the objectives and the goals within which it operates. And next slide, please. Now, the sixth principle that we have identified as necessary is the respect for human rights. You know, we do have what we call the UN human rights principles for businesses, but they're often seen as an external framework to how businesses must observe human rights frameworks or must respect human rights practices in the country. And we believe that for the first time now, we have corporate governance principles that acknowledge that human rights and observation and respect of human rights must be part of the everyday agenda for every board meeting, and not something that we do and we engage or comply with as and when it suits the company. Similarly, environmental responsibility, no doubt, the environment is an issue that impacts all of our lives, all of our businesses, and so there is a need for businesses to not only respect human environmental rights, but also to report on it and to be able to share those reports. Technology, innovation, and adaptability. Again, I mentioned that we developed these principles during COVID. And at that time, we recognized that the only SMEs particularly, and I don't speak about large companies because we found they were well-resourced in this regard, but the only SMEs that managed to survive or that did not take as huge a blow were SMEs that had invested in technology. And without technology, most companies unfortunately died. And so this now becomes a critical aspect of how a company or an organization manages itself, the investment in its technology, in innovation and adaptability. And of course, then, you know, if you look at what's going on in the continent now, 2 years ago, the African Union and all member states ratified the CFTA, the African Continental Trade Area Agreement. And so therefore, every business that is engaging on the continent or that's operating in different parts of the African continent has got to be not only ensure that it enhances its own standing on the continent, but that it elaborates and expands the value chain across different countries. So these are the 9 principles that we believe going forward should be applicable on the African continent. And we believe so because, as I mentioned earlier on, they cover not only just the best practices that have been developed in the world, but we also begin to look at what makes sense for Africa. And it's a starting, what we've said to ourselves is that we are just starting with this. And we acknowledge that moving forward, there will be other ideas, that there will be ideas will evolve, and therefore we may need at some point in time to actually relook at them and say, how do we enhance these business practices to ensure that our economies grow and to ensure that our economies are more inclusive than they are at the moment. Next slide, please. So what I will do now, I will just speak to this next slide, the next one, which only focuses really on multinationals and the listed firms with regards to what these corporate governance principles and guidelines mean. So if you move on to the next slide, you will see that with regards to the guidelines, first of all, what does it mean to have a shared purpose with the country, with the society and the community within which you operate? This is now particularly for multinationals now. And that means there has to be a commitment in the company for what is generally known as CSR, corporate social responsibility. But social corporate responsibility exists outside of what is known as corporate governance. However, these corporate governance principles provide that corporate social responsibilities is required to be part and parcel of what a company not only performs but reports on. And so these are guidelines, as they are called, in terms of what could those be. And all our countries have different priorities at this stage. But broadly, the issues that cut across all of our countries involve, for instance, skills development, protection of employees, local and enterprise and supplier development, and that these multinationals must ensure that there are programs that contribute to local job creation and the creation of sustainable local SMEs. And how do you do that? By bringing into the company and making sure that the procurement processes and rules of that company are biased towards the local suppliers, are biased towards the local attorneys or lawyers who provide services to that company, are biased towards the local auditors, because we know that most of the international companies tend to rely very much on those suppliers that are in their parent company country, So again, preferential and local procurement rules, but also programs that are aimed at supplier development and also human rights reporting. And also what we have suggested is that in order to ensure that this is not only part of the strategy of the company, but that it's considered by a board on each of the board meetings, we have identified that there needs to be a subcommittee called the Public Policy and Sustainability Subcommittee, which will look at all of these issues. So basically, what we have found at APRM, and I must say that when I say APRM, we really work with a number of institutions. And those institutions are expert institutions based on the continent. So what we have found is that if we begin to move in the direction of putting in place governance, or rather corporate governance practices that ensure inclusivity and that ensure that our economies are not simply guided by imported practices, then we are able to define our own goals in that regard. So like I said earlier on, I did mention that I will be very happy to distribute the presentation that you see. I'll be happy as well to take any questions that you have. My presentation does go into detail, which I think may not necessarily be necessary for today, but into detail as to then what each of the categories of SMEs, family-owned businesses, what each of those principles entail. Thank you very much.